Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kim Fox, and I'm the Executive Director for the Pawleys Island Litchfield Business Association, known as Pilba. And just would like to ask everyone to please stay muted throughout the event. And please use the chat box if you have any comments or have any questions. And at the end of our interview with Councilman Goggans, we will address your comments and questions and try to get to as many of those as possible. We are trying to keep this event down to an hour. So if everybody could just hang tight, we'll get to your comments and questions at the end. And it's my pleasure to introduce the Vice President of Pilba, Kathy Grace, who will be interviewing Councilman Steve Goggans.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Goggans, a Georgetown County Councilman for District 6. Steve resides in Pawleys Island with his wife and 2 children and holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in pre-architecture from Clemson University and a master's degree in community and regional planning from the University of Alaska. He's been a licensed architect since 1982 and is founder and owner of SGA Architecture, headquartered in Pawleys Island. Steve's a governmental affairs director for the South Carolina chapter of the American Institute of Architects, serves on the board of the Pawleys Island Music Festival, and is a former chairman of the Citizens for Ocean Highway, He has served on numerous boards and task forces over the years, many as a council appointee, and is a past recipient of the Volunteer of the Year Award presented by the Pawleys Island Rotary Club. He's graciously agreed to this interview session sponsored by the Pawleys Island Litchfield Business Association as a continued service to the business owners and residents of the Waccamaw Neck. The focus of this interview will be for the purpose of gaining a better understanding of the U.S. Land Use Planning Corridor Companion Study and how it may affect growth and development here along the Waccamaw Neck. Thanks, Steve, for taking the time to participate, and we'll get started.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Tell everybody, what's the background and purpose for the companion study, and how does that relate to the current GSAT's US 17 corridor study?
Well, background is that in consideration of projects that have been done along US Highway 17 in prior years, the fact that we had not done a corridor study since 2003, and in addition, the community had experienced rapid growth. It was my feeling increasingly that we were lacking any true direction, and there was a lack of planning along the corridor. When we talk about planning the corridor, typically in the past that's been done by SCDOT, and they've looked at just the movement of traffic and vehicles only, without consideration to the surrounding land use. So the companion corridor study is really an effort to understand land use around the corridor. And the idea is that once we understand the future of our land use and have consensus around how that will work, then that better informs how we design our highways. So that's a little bit of the background. Early in my term, went to SCDOT and was able to obtain a grant or some money. And that handled the traffic component of the Highway 17 corridor study and was managed by GSAT and the transportation planner, Mark Holweller of COG. In a perfect world, we would have had just one study, not 2 studies, but the 2 studies came about in large part because of the way the studies were funded. The county then generously agreed to a $200,000 grant to do the land use part, and a selection committee was set up. The firm Stantec was chosen, very large firm with multiple divisions, and the contracts were written such that the 2 studies were supposed to be brought in congruence. The GSAT's corridor study is not yet finished, but the Stantec land use planning corridor study is. And of course, that's the focus of today's webinar.
Great. So what's the process for developing the companion study? Touched on that a bit.
Well, it was a part of the priority of the plan or the study was to get wide public input, and the contract was written that way, and the selection committee that selected Stantec in interviewing chose a firm that they thought could garner that input. So they had to come to the table with a plan, a program for how they were going to gather input. So the first thing that occurred were some focus group meetings that were done in Murrells Inlet, and that was done in September 19. Subsequently, there was an almost 1 week long charrette that anybody could attend, but for organizational purposes, the charrette was divided into groups called residents, business, youth, history, art, parks and open space, and multimodal transportation. So those were the public input components, and they were pretty well attended over a number of days that those occurred. A rough draft was submitted to the steering committee in December 19, but then COVID hit. Plus, the traffic part of the corridor study had not been completed, so things kind of went into the hold pattern until this past fall, and it was decided that rather than wait on the corridor study to be absolutely complete, they had enough data to finish. So the process most recently culminated in another virtual meeting a month or so ago, and so the study is now judged to be complete.
Okay. My next question was going to be, had the public had an opportunity to participate, but you've answered that one, and I did attend some of those meetings myself back in 2019, and I'm glad that the public has had that opportunity. What were some of the key findings of the companion study?
Well, the study is, if you do any good plan, you've got to understand the context and the existing community. So a lot of data was collected early on. An economist was involved, and some of the findings were rather interesting and surprised even me, even though I've been here for 35 years. But one of the things the study, some of our listeners may have surmised, but one of the things the study confirmed is that we're largely in the built-out phase of development of the Waccamaw Neck. And population is probably not going to increase too much more. It's probably peaked. The destiny of the Waccamaw Neck was largely set into motion in the late 80s and mid 90s, when the large planned communities such as Willbrook, Heritage, Polly's Plantation, Wachasaw, some of those communities were planned and began to fill in. So we're kind of in the closing chapter of the build out of the Waccamaw Neck, and that's where we are today. So consequently, the plan focused primarily again on land adjacent to the corridor and beyond, but didn't attempt to address some of the other planned communities and subdivisions. But one of the findings that was rather interesting, in addition to where we are in the game, is how little land remains to be developed. Only about 4%, or 1,900 acres, of the total land on the Waccamaw Neck remains to be developed. And we look around and we think, well, how could that be? But 58% of the land is in conservation. Some 20% is already developed. Another 12% is environmentally challenged or compromised. There's a small percentage that are kind of infill lots. I've used the example of like Litchfield Country Club or Hagley, scattering of lots. But again, we're really not talking about that much land that is left to be developed. Another thing the study did, or finding, was it mapped demographics, and again, some of this stuff you can intuit. If you go to the grocery store, look around, you can make a determination about demographics. But interestingly, 51% of our community is retiree or senior. 2% of those are empty nesters. Only 9% of our community is in their family years. That's ages 35 to 54. We have 0% of our community is young workforce, 20 to 34. Now, do we maybe know somebody that fits that category? Certainly, but as a percentage, it was almost immeasurable. And then 29% of our population is school aged. So just a few things that they determined. Another interesting couple of statistics, and then we'll get on into the study. 67% of all the renters in the study area are younger than 55. 34% of the new housing stock has been seasonal housing, which impacts affordability and year-round residents. So anyway, just a few of the things. And then there was some economics that data that suggested over the next 30 years, you might be able to accommodate a bit more office space, a certain number of residences, and things like that. Now, the community weighed in, and one of the things that it emphasized was as goals. These were articulated in perhaps a more refined way by Stantec, but the goals of the study were to prioritize the human experience, honor the history of the area, protect the natural beauty and provide access to it, promote connectivity for all modes of transportation, and require neighborhood and village scale design. And finally, expand housing options that promote equity. And again, this came from the public input. And then in terms of what the community values from, again, the public input, natural environment for beauty and ecological value, walkable villages, recreation choices, convenient access to everything, and safe and comfortable mobility, in parentheses, not in a car. So those are a few of the findings, and starting from that base point, then Stantec began to evolve some concepts and some guidelines for how the community might evolve. I want to emphasize that this is a study. It's not an ordinance. Nothing in it is mandated. It's again a study and points away to the future that is reflective of the input that was gleaned from the community in these various sessions. So,
Well, 2021 happens to mark my 30th year as a Waccamaw Neck resident, and I love telling a lot of folks new to the area that I got to move here when reserve and tradition were nothing more than pine forests and a historic cemetery. But I have watched this county do an excellent job of developing that area, and I came to Litchfield when things were in a bit of disarray, and that property has developed beautifully, and I think been a compliment to the many families that have the county has welcomed. So I think you all have done a great job over those 30 years, realizing you may not have been in county government that time, but it's been interesting to watch. And also as a parent of a high school kid headed off to college, I really found the numbers you shared very interesting. But let's move on to the primary concepts in the companion study.
Well, the concept is that you'll see are really development strategies. And one of the things that we all know is that we've got the Waccamaw Neck, which is a community, a sub-community of Georgetown County. And then within the Waccamaw Neck, we've got three additional sub-communities, obviously, or nuclei, and those can be considered Pawleys Island, then we've got Litchfield, and then we've got Murrells Inlet. And for study purposes, and because there are a few differences within those sub-communities in terms of streetscape, landscape, development, etc., they define these areas as character areas. They can be thought of as villages. So one of the things Stantec advocates for is connecting, and this came from the community too, making the community more walkable. Well, the way you do that is we define some areas like these villages, and we actually introduce pedestrian infrastructure, and we allow some mixed use so that people can park the car, can live, work, play, shop without having to leave that environment, or at the very least, if they're out shopping or going to work, they can again park the car and they don't have to get back out on the highway. So another concept was to develop a 17 multimodal path that would lead up and down the Waccamaw Neck and interconnect these villages. So those were strategies early on. It does promote open space, while at the same time proposing some clustering in and around these village areas. There are strategies for how you produce open space. So I'll show some examples of that when we get into the document itself.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you to do next. It might be easier for folks. I know it's a 40-page study, but it might be easier maybe to take us through it.
All right. Well, let me proceed. I'm going to move rather rapidly through the document. Some of this I've already covered.
Right.
I'm going to return to this page, but these are the top 10 projects and plans and initiatives over the next 5 years that the community articulated they wanted to see. So I'm not going to dwell on these now. I think we'll conclude the presentation with these projects and elements. Okay. This talks about the visioning of the principles and again, gleaned from public input, and the plan purpose is here. Going to continue to move. This is the context I mentioned. These are the statistics I mentioned where you've got the various, how the land is currently used on the Waccamaw Neck. The Waccamaw Neck comprises 65 square miles. And again, 58% is conserved or public. Think Brook Green, Hopcaw, Arcadia, a good bit of which is under a conservation easement, those kinds of spaces. And you can begin to understand a little better why we maybe only have 4% of our lands left. This just summarizes the public input and the organization of the plan. There was a steering committee. I was on the steering committee, as was Councilman Thomas, and this describes the focus group meetings. Some of the economic findings and backgrounds. Again, they had an economist as part of their team. And you'll notice some of the, some of the data that they gleaned, median age 58.6 years, number of households 11,500, 27,000 population, shows your income or median income is quite high. The median housing value is $319,000. Now that's risen just in the last year by quite a bit. And I can talk a little bit about that later too.
Steve, I'm just going to interrupt you for just a second. We're starting to see some questions, which Kim Fox is going to help us moderate. But just so everyone knows, we're going to give you the links to not only this study, but 2 other important studies that marry with this. So appreciate your patience. We'll let Steve finish up here.
All right, happy to talk about other studies as well. This talks again about the demographics, summarizing public input. And I think I went the wrong way, guys, forgive me. Okay. Okay, so strategies. This is something, these graphics are something that everybody has pored over and dwells over. So one of the things Stantec did is it took various areas of the highway and with our setbacks and other things began to look at how we might develop a better streetscape. And these are some examples. It was Stantec's observation that we have too much asphalt, too much parking in front of buildings. They want to put some of this in back of buildings and or maybe eliminate parking altogether. And this does create the potential opportunity for the multimodal path you're looking at here. Now, this is going to require SCDOT approval, funding, and all kinds of things. It's aspirational, but does have a lot of potential to, I think, happen in future years. I keep going in the opposite direction, folks. All right, and so taking then some of the study areas that they more specifically study. Now, these are conceptual, they're graphic, but what they did do is adhered fairly closely to existing zoning. They didn't try to change zoning or make too many assumptions, but this is a hospital area. And this is called the Myrtle's Inlet District. It shows some connections to the waterfront, shows some of the existing character. And then down, I can't get this page set right, but up here you see an example of some strip development. Maybe that's better. That exists, and then this is how it might be refined with the multimodal path, some reduction in parking, some improved landscaping, all of which was advocated by Stantec. And this is Litchfield Exchange, that area. The county has a building that they own in here. We've got the ball fields over here, so some existing development. The old Harris Teeter Shopping Center exists. And what they did is kept the existing buildings. You can see those here in aerial form using GIS. And then they put in additional development that again was consistent with existing zoning in general. So, and that's what that might look like. Not tomorrow, but again, this is a 20, 30 year plan or study. Mm-hmm. So you get these different sorts of visualization efforts. McKenzie Beach, some of the public, many of the public said this would be a great area to preserve and maintain. So they did a graphic for it. This is the Willbrook Highway 17 intersection that was reworked to make it more pedestrian friendly. That's the existing and the proposed with the multimodal path nearby. Mm-hmm. Skip over some of these. And this is an area, downtown Pawleys. This is the Island Shops again, and you can see how it's been rendered. Again, took an aerial, did a land plan study See it here. I morphed it into some three-dimensional stuff.
Mhm.
This is the downtown Pawleys area, and you see then this graphic. Again, fairly consistent with, for the most part, with the zoning, but you can see how around the village areas we do, they are suggesting a little more tightness, a little more clustering of uses. And again, these are mixed-use communities, but the idea is that if one lives here, you know, you've got easy access to offices and or shopping. Go ahead.
Does the study advocate for more density?
The study is density neutral. Again, in consideration of clustering around these three or so areas, it also advocates for open space and conservation in perimeter areas or areas in between. Again, the gated communities, the planned communities that exist, they're there probably in perpetuity. Not much will ever change with them. So it's those areas on the periphery, and they show us some techniques for managing that. But again, the study is density neutral, and the zoning is, their studies and visualizations are pretty consistent with existing zoning. This is a graphic. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This is a graphic that illustrates, it's illustrative of, regarding density. If you have the right tools in place for conserving open space, then, and you have a policy and development plan that offers that direction, this is what a typical single family community would look like. There's an old joke in the planning business that the opposite of density is sprawl. So this is, this spreads out, and this kind of development comprises probably a vast majority of the Waccamaw Neck already.
Right.
Cluster into townhomes, then you have the opportunity to begin to look at conserving some open space, and then of course if you build even more compactly, you save even more. So some of the tools that were listed as a way for managing the open space on a policy basis are transfer development rights. My firm's doing a project in Greenville. We are using this very tool. But the idea is you have a cinder zone, and let's say this is an area that you want to conserve. We've not done a great greenway study yet on the Waccamaw Neck, but we have a greenway area, or we have an area that we think is important to protect for environmental reasons or others. And maybe that is the send zone. And then you've got the receiving zone. The receiving zone, of course, would be the areas around the character areas or villages that I mentioned. And the owner of the send zone benefits because they're compensated for downzoning their property. The receiving zone benefits allow more clustered development. And again, that gets back to creating opportunities for parts of our community to be walkable at the end of the day.
Right.
Okay. And then
Yes.
go ahead.
Nope, I was going to ask you the next question, but finish your thought.
And then to summarize, I think everyone can read this, but there are the top 10 projects that came out of the public input. The first and foremost is to complete the shared use path along US Highway 17. Now that project, Friday a week ago, we had a ribbon cutting up in North Litchfield, John Thomas's district, and we completed a major section of the corridor, the multimodal path, and that's many thanks to Linda Ketron for all of her years. But we want to complete that on downwards, and the public obviously wants to see that too. It's the number one goal. This study did not go into deeply into the commercial area off of Murrells Inlet. It was not part of the original scope or funding, but it was certainly identified or suggested that a future study needs to focus on Business 17 area of Murrells Inlet. And then through zoning incentives, encourage a diversity of affordable housing throughout the neck, create a public greenway system. And I can define that if people don't know what that is. Acquire the historic McKenzie Beach property. Prioritize the key village intersections. If you think about Pawleys Island now and trying to get across Highway 17, it's impossible. And even though there's a pedestrian crosswalk at Willbrook Boulevard, it's still a rather precarious feeling to make that crossing if you're on a bike or a pedestrian. Mm-hmm. So this is an obvious one. Install character-driven signage and landscaping in the villages. We need to beef up our landscaping. And I hope to get an ordinance underway on sometime in the next year in that regard. Update ordinances to enhance tree protection. That's in motion. Update ordinances to preserve beneficial wetlands and floodways. And then 50% of the remaining land in the Waccamaw Neck. So what that means is, so we got 4% of our land remaining. It's a pretty high bar, but we do want that 4%, a portion of it, a goodly portion of it, to be open space. And then finally, redirect growth towards previously developed parcels. One of the things they noted with their economist help was that we have an abundance of retail, too much retail really, so that we have some empty stores, we have underused retail, and that's even manifested by the fact rent rates are low. So the idea is to, rather than having 18 miles of wall-to-wall retail interrupted maybe only by Brook Green Gardens, we again cluster around these village areas, and we gradually over time eliminate the strip development that we have between those areas. So this is a reflection, this is a public way of expressing that whole concept. So
okay.
Anyway, those are the 10 projects.
Yes, and if I can back up to one, we've had you mentioned affordable housing in that list. What's meant by affordable housing? I think that term has been bantered around a bit.
Well, there's the euphemistic definition, which is affordable can mean, what somebody earning the most minimal amount of money can afford. That's euphemistic and hopefully not cynical definition. But there is a technical definition or a federal, defined by HUD, federal government. Normally that means 60 to 80% of area median income. So if the U.S. agency HUD would define affordable as they would take a census tract and whatever the median income is in that tract, and that's all documented. Mm-hmm. I gave the median income for our area just a few minutes ago, $57,000 and change per annum. So household income would have to be anywhere from 60 to 80% of that. Now, if you're a developer of affordable housing, a developer coming in, and your incentive towards targeting for that kind of price point or rent or affordability is or based on tax incentives, local and federal. So that's how you get it done typically. But there's a huge housing demand right now, shortage of supply at really all levels. And so affordable housing is going to be one of our challenges in the future, if not, if not at market rate.
Okay. Yeah, I actually, Pilba's advocacy committee was working on median household income, and in Georgetown County, I believe it's $26,000, which is a staggeringly low figure. But I actually am trying to get some data from COG as to what it is along the Waccamaw Neck, because obviously with a county as diverse as Georgetown, you're going to have extreme highs and extreme lows. But for the county as an average, I believe it was 26,000, and then household income was 44,800, which is much lower than I would have expected, but we'll see what those numbers come back with to the advocacy.
Well, our county is like a couple of other coastal counties along our coast, and in that the Waccamaw Neck is by most definitions very wealthy. Again, the median income is about $57,000 and change. But you can see how there's obviously a lot of in the rural areas of the county, it's a lot different, and the overall average is low.
Yes. Okay. So where does the companion corridor study go from here?
Well, again, it's a study, and it proposes various action items, and those are the way the corridor study will be used, I think, is it'll inform as to ordinances and regulations and incentives that the county and the Waccamaw Neck would want to encourage. I mentioned the landscape ordinance. I would hope that sometime in the next year we can have a landscape ordinance for the Waccamaw Neck. We're currently, staff is currently working on an improved tree ordinance. So a lot of the goals that are articulated are going to be brought to fruition by those kind of actions. The Highway 17, what the study also does is, obviously Highway 17 is a federal highway, typically administered, generally administered by SCDOT and an agency or an organization called GSATs. So this is the county's, this study suggests what the county wants the highway to be and how it wants it to function. So hopefully, as SCDOT develops its plans in future years, this will be a reference point for them. So I think we're going to have to work with SCDOT and other agencies to make sure that what happens along within the right-of-way of Highway 17 becomes whatever becomes manifest is in accord with this with what's expressed in this document. Okay.
Kathy, did we lose you, Kathy? Kathy Grace, did we lose you? Well, Steve, I'll take it from here. I think that she gave me a copy of the questions, so we'll go ahead and look at the chat room. But I do want everybody to know that I just posted in the chat room the links to the companion study that Steve was showing us, as well as the corridor study done by GSAT and SCDOT for you to access. So let me go to the first question from Heather Kinder. You mentioned 4% is available for development, but that only included plots larger than 1 acre. Can you please share the total land that is available for development, including those parcels that are less than 1 acre?
I actually don't have that data. I'm quoting from the study, and I have to pretty much take it at face value. I can do some research with planning staff and can try to turn that up for Ms. Kinder. Typically, if it's a half acre or less and zoned residential, then it's going to be captured under the scattered lots category that I gave a statistic on. I think that's 12%. If it's a half acre or less and commercial, it's going to have limited development ability, not nothing, but limited. So, but I can make some inquiries of Stantec and will be happy to respond back to Ms. Kinder if she, is there a way that she can leave her contact information?
Well, if you just want to give that to me, I can email
Okay.
that information to her, or we can get that information to whoever wants that. So she does
Sure.
ask another question. Steve, there are also 3 golf courses mentioned, Litchfield Country Club, Founders, and Caledonia, as being available to redevelop in their current zoning. Looking at the map in the study, it appears that those golf courses are not currently included in the 4%, the 1,900 acre figure. How many additional acres would this add to the 1,900 acre total?
Well, I can tell you from having designed a number of golf course communities or planned, a typical golf course is 125 acres or less. The more modern ones are 125, the older ones probably more like 100. So that would give you an idea of what those might represent. So you probably are somewhere between 300, 375 acres total. I remember there being discussion about the golf courses were brought up in the public input meetings. What do we do about them, etc. Downzoning is very tricky legally, but I think one of the things Walk My Neck needs to do, and the community needs to do, is find some strategies for how they treat those 3 golf courses over the if they ever go down. I'd be happy to work with communities or form a task force on how we do that. Conservation easements come to mind where you could, the landowner might obtain some tax benefit. You can do certain things with zoning, but that's tricky again. But I understand the concern there. But getting back to the original question, it was assumed they would not be developed, and hopefully that's not wishful thinking.
Steve, Diane Draper said she's very interested in how this plan promotes open space with examples. I'm not sure if the density example that you showed in the plan answers that question, but you may want to, if there's something else you can expand upon for open space.
Well, the goal of the study was to be density neutral. So in order for there to be reasonable clustering in some of the village areas, and I have to add that most of those areas were they maintained the existing zoning. They didn't try to up it. You don't see any packed mid-rises or anything like that there. But anyway, that said, the perimeter properties and the properties that would be along greenways that are currently can be developed. I'm thinking about the tracts that are zone GR that are along some of the swamps and low areas, wetlands. They're not necessarily wetland themselves by regulation, but they are not wetlands. Some of those areas might be targeted for preservation, conservation. So then you have to create a set of tools or develop a set of tools that you can use. TDR was one of those. I mean, plain old zoning's another. But you give people incentives for being willing to downzone their property, and again, the goal with clustering around these villages areas is we get away from strip development, and we can park the car, we can walk, and we don't have sprawl all over the neck. That's the basic goal. But the tools are TDR, zoning, and I'm wanting to Another ordinance I would like to see us develop is a conservation ordinance, so that we do put certain property into conservation. And Beaufort County has a ordinance like that, as for example. So don't know if I answered the question, but that's the way we maintain a kind of an even density, but have some open space, have some clustering.
Mary Beth Klein asked, please also comment specifically on how elements of this plan mitigates the infrastructure issues we face today, specifically flooding and congestion. Thank you.
Well, agencies from the EPA right on down espouse, I almost hate to use the term smart growth, but they espouse having communities where you can live, work, play, that are mixed use and a little more compact. Why? So that you can park the car and you can decrease traffic. So when people have to commute in from neighboring counties to work, to, or we have to get into our car to go shop or to go to the office, that creates congestion. So a lot of the destiny of the neck is already cast in stone, quite candidly, because of the small amount of area we have left for development because of what we're talking about here. But you reduce congestion by using these tools. Again, building more compactly, walkability, more open space in certain areas. Regarding, and I assume Mary Beth is talking about roadways. Most of our infrastructure has got a lot of capacity. Our schools, lots of capacity. We've got more school space than we need. Water sewer capacity, fine. No problems. So the only place our infrastructure is being tested that I'm aware is primarily Highway 17. With respect to drainage, drainage has become problematic in recent years. And I could talk an hour just on drainage, but it is a requirement every new project. I wrote an editorial on this not too long ago, Coastal Observer, that you might refer back to if you'd like to be interested in my views on drainage. But under any new project that's built today has to meet the Georgetown County Drainage Ordinance and has to have a permit from the Stormwater Division. It's also reviewed by OCRM and permitted by OCRM, which is a division of DHEC. And under those laws and ordinances, if you're doing a new project, you have to, your post-development runoff can be no greater than your pre-development. So any new project has to design its drainage so it's contributing, in theory, not one drop more of water in terms of runoff. Now, having said that, we've got a lot of older communities that don't have engineered drainage. And those are going to have to be remedied in the years ahead. We're going to have to go into Litchfield Country Club, Hagley, communities like that, communities along Martin Luther King Road, and some of the communities in Murrells Inlet. And we're going to have to retroactively install drainage. And the county is engaged in a stormwater master plan, which is the first phase, I think, of developing a plan for how we deal with all that future drainage. So it's the older communities and the fact that they're filling in now that are where we're seeing most of our drainage issues manifest. If you drive through the country club, there's only a small number of lots left. Hagley, a small number of lots left. So a few years ago, a lot more of those communities were open and undeveloped.
Very true.
Okay, thank you. Gary Weinwich, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, has several questions. I'm going to ask the first two as I'm going down the list here. Why have you not addressed the recommendations to adopt form-based code, and what are the pros and cons?
All right, form-based code is a type of zoning that is viewed by some as kind of the future of zoning. The zoning I'm going to give you just a tiny bit of background. Zoning we have today is called Euclidean zoning. It was first invented in 1927 as a result of a lawsuit in Euclid, Ohio. It basically divides the uses and is kind of a meat axe approach to zoning. In the 1970s, when Georgetown County, when the Waccamaw Neck specifically undertook zoning, basically the way zoning occurred to get it passed politically was a function of going out and asking various landowners what they wanted their land use to be. So we're kind of left with that remnants of those zoning efforts. And then you've got the planned communities that came in the 80s and 90s and superimposed over that. So getting back to your question, Gary, form-based zoning, I think, could be an effective tool. It's a very sophisticated tool, and what it involves are a series of trade-offs. So it's not totally unlike a PD or flex zone. So in exchange for giving a developer an incentive of some kind, maybe he gets to build a little bit more on a site. He has to do certain things, put in a playground, put in a park, put in enhanced landscaping, adhere to more rigorous aesthetic controls, those kinds of things. I think it could work well on the Waccamaw Neck. My only misgiving is that it's a little more difficult to administer. We have a very limited zoning staff in Georgetown County right now. To administer an ordinance like that might require a little more manpower and a little more sophistication. Plus, the thing has to be written. So those are my reservations about it at the moment, but it's something I think we should look at in the future.
Gary also asked, does your density neutral assurance depend on property rights transfers?
No, no, it does not. We have the underlying zoning to start with. I think we've got some things located in the wrong places. In particular, if we want to move things around and cluster while we leave open space, I think that's where we need some specific tools, and our land plan needs to reflect things like where the donor zones and the center zones and things like that are. But the study inherently doesn't contemplate increasing any of the density. In fact, I think Craig Lewis and his group bent over backwards to make sure they didn't recommend or espouse increased density overall.
Gary, I know you've asked a couple other questions, and I will get to those, but I want to just take them in the order of which they were posted. Peg Howe basically makes a statement. I don't think there's a question there. It's not 60 to 80%, as Mr. Goggans just said. Affordable housing is generally defined as housing on which the occupant is paying no more than 30% of gross income for housing cost, including utilities, and she references the HUD.gov website.
Well, I respectfully don't totally disagree with Peg, but I will say that my firm has done 70,000 units over time, and we do affordable housing. And it is defined in different ways, but if you're going for tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, you can do an 80% program, you can do a 60% program. 30 is extraordinarily aggressive and typically requires local participation to the extent that it would sell bonds or provide extreme local incentives. Places like Columbia, Charleston have housing authorities. They sell bonds which subsidize, but when you get down to the 30% range, you're almost talking about Section 8 housing. So, but 80%, 60% is done frequently all over the, all over the Southeast, all over the country.
Susanna Corand, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, probably not, but sorry. Can you please elaborate on the small land use and parking plan for Murrells Inlet?
Land use and parking plans for Murrells Inlet. Well, I can flip back and show those artists' conceptions, and these are conceptual studies, and we can look at those.
And we're going to make those available to everyone at the end of this as well, the links to these.
No, I already posted them, Kathy.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So here, it's a little tough to read, but here you have a plan of the medical district of Murrells Inlet. This is the hospital. I've got my cursor on. Medical office buildings up here. And down here, you have the inlet, of course. And there is a proposed, they were suggesting some connector roads be put in. I don't know if this housing here exists or is proposed, but basically the study against the corridor, not here. It was suggested as a goal that the number 2 goal that this area be studied of Murrells Inlet. But other than the multimodal path along Highway 17, enhanced landscaping, better connectivity, and maybe creating some clustering in these areas, that's pretty much what they suggested. Mostly treatment of the architecture and the landscape architecture was what I remember being shown in Murrells Inlet. For instance, this area is the area in front of the little strip center that has Swift appliances. It used to be next to where the steakhouse is that burned.
T-Bones.
T-Bones. So that's the existing strip today. This is what is suggested. So it's more of a treatment of the highway than it is a serious dive into land planning in Murrells Inlet. And of course, Murrells Inlet is largely built out with a few exceptions. I mean, there are some tracts up there that are being contemplated for development and are zoned thusly, but it's south of the mall site. There's not too much left that can be developed. Most of this is going to be enhancement and upgrades.
We have, we're just at an hour since we've started. I do have a couple other questions.
Mm-hmm.
Let me, wait, hold on a second. I think Gary asks, past population growth has been high. What makes you believe it has peaked? Why does report ask if we want to capture some of Horry and Charleston County's growth?
Well, that's a question any planner would ask early on when he's trying to understand the community and the desires of the population. Do you want to grow? Do you not want to grow? How much do you want to grow? So that was probably a question posited during the data gathering phase. But I think the community spoke to that, and the final report speaks to the idea that we have limited growth potential by virtue of the amount of land we have left to develop, and that density would be kept roughly the same. If you see where my cursor is right now, there. One of the things the community does want is to redirect growth towards previously developed parcels by using transfer development rights. And I think that's a reflection of a lot of people I remember talking about the abandoned Harris Teeter being underutilized and things like that. But I don't think this plan, even there's no part of it that I think suggests we're going to start moving part of Horry County into the Waccamaw Neck.
And it's important, I think, to note this was all done pre-pandemic. Our commercial space is probably realizing a complete transformation in the midst of the pandemic as well. Commercial and retail space is going to shift.
Sure.
Gary asked, why have you not mentioned your recommendation to reduce setbacks and increase building heights?
Gary's got a lot of questions today, but happy to answer, Gary. So on 17, it became very controversial. I'll acknowledge that. I proposed that we reduce setbacks to 50 feet. And that was my belief that if we didn't do that, then we were going to wind up one day with continuous parking lots, wall to wall to wall, as we marched up and down 17. And I've never found parking lots to be particularly pleasing aesthetically. And so that was the origins behind doing that. This study does not, to the best of my knowledge, stipulate changing the right-of-way. It was heavily discussed during the generation of the proposal, and Stantec independently of me wanted to know what the origins of the 90-foot setback was. There didn't seem to be a good answer. So they felt it was too large because, just like I did, they felt that there were way too much asphalt. And what they want to do is reduce setbacks so you can move buildings closer to the street, you park behind, plus you have more room for this intermodal, multimodal pathway that we're talking about, bicycles and vehicles. Simple as that. Better chance to landscape, hide the cars, put a pathway in. Height was discussed about modestly increasing height, but not allowing more than 2 stories in the commercial areas, keeping the floor levels the same. And that was a discussion item. I don't know that that recommendation exists in the plan. But as an architect, we typically, when we do retail or office, we typically plan on from a floor to floor height, a first floor of 14 feet. In commercial buildings, you got to allow room for heating and air, lighting, all that stuff. Plus, you like to have at least a 10-foot plate height or wall. And then you're off the grade a little bit on top of that. So starting with that and then putting, stacking 9 or 10 foot on top of that, and then allowing for a sloped roof. Remember the the Waccamaw Neck overlay guidelines want sloped roofs. it was felt that we needed to probably boost height, 3-4 feet. So simple as that. It was all about accommodating the architecture and being able to produce a good architectural product. One that was attractive and had sloped roofs and was in keeping with the community guidelines.
Steve, we have 3 more, and folks, that's all we're going to take for today. And thank you all for your participation. But Peggy Howe said concerning drainage, if the standard is that the new development not allow more runoff than was probably previously there, there doesn't seem to be any appreciation for the very real impact of increased storm intensity, increased sea level rise, and subsidence. It would seem that future development should anticipate future needs for stormwater management. How does this plan accommodate future stormwater management needs?
This plan doesn't, frankly, get into stormwater to any significant degree. It wasn't part of its aegis. That's why the county's spending almost $1 million now to do a master stormwater drainage plan. But what this plan does do is it advocates for open space, and it advocates for greenways and preservation of wetlands. That's all scattered all throughout the document. So, those are the things that it reasonably could address, and those are all consistent with good stormwater management and sustainability.
Last 2 questions, both from Gary. Is it not possible to achieve all the recreational and conservation goals without the zoning changes recommended by Santec?
So do you mind reading that one more time, Kim?
Is it not possible to achieve all the recreational and conservation goals without the zoning changes recommended by Santec? But I thought that you said earlier there is no zoning changes that they're recommending.
No, none that I'm aware of. The zoning. Forgive me, I'm not understanding the question completely.
Well, Gary, if you'd like, you can put in the text, the chat box, your email, and I'll be happy to give that to Steve, or along with that question, and then your last question, and Steve can address it directly to you. But this is the last question for today. People are attracted to the neck because it's different from where they live. Why do we want to urbanize the neck and risk losing our character? Look at the sketches of the redevelopment areas.
Well, first of all, we just the opposite. What this plan does, and what your viewer is apparently focusing on, are those 3 village areas. And what the plan is trying to do is redirect development, so we don't have 22 miles of strip development, and that's rather banal looking up and down the highway. I often hear it said, we don't want to look like Garden City. Well, every year that goes by, we're increasingly looking like Garden City, in my opinion. And that's because we have obsolete retail and underutilized retail and office and commercial scattered up and down Highway 17. So what this plan contemplates is trying to cluster that into more discrete areas, and then having open space, green space, or at least housing in between. And where you bring people in a little more tightly than behind that or around that, and again through greenways, you have open space. At a smaller scale, this is not unlike Charleston's Greenbelt, where or Beaufort County, where the town set a perimeter for growth, and said, we're not growing beyond these boundaries, and we're going to preserve the farms and landscape and et cetera to the best we can, extent we can, in the outlying areas, and not continue to sprawl all over the place. So that's what this plan does, along with creating, walkable community and making this a more attractive and pleasant place to live.
Well, Councilman Goggans, on behalf of the Polly's Island Litchfield Business Association, the residents of the Waccamaw Neck, and the participants in today's Zoom event, I'd like to thank you for participating in the interview and taking our questions so that it helps us become more educated on exactly what the Sandtech folks were recommending in their study, as well as being able to look at the GSAT report. So this is the end of our session, and thanks everybody for their time. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and week.
Thank you, everyone.